Changing subjects on you a little bit. Obviously, in the news a lot has been the Russia investigation, Russian probe, special counsel investigation, even to taking Donald Trump's personal attorney's office and raiding it. Let's start out, though, at the beginning, and that, to me, is Comey and Hillary, and Hillary's emails. I know it's 2 years old, but concisely tell me what was wrong with Hillary's emails, and what did Comey do right or wrong?
Well, where it started, we could say sometime you're in the right time frame, when Hillary, was a high-level government official. I mean, let's face it, Hillary was one of the top people in our government, and she had dealings with the Russians, and just at the same time she was having dealings with the Russians, they ended up putting hundreds of millions of dollars into the Clinton Foundation. And during that same time period, guess what? There's a negotiation going on which will result in America losing 20% of our uranium assets to the control of a Russian company. Now, these things are out there, and yeah, that should be where we start our investigation, but they have ignored that.
That's not just lobbying. That's pure graft.
Right.
Right.
And
pay to play.
I have been, what people know about me is I go and I do things. So I have made it a point to go out and get involved with various things here to find out what's going on. And by the way, they don't like that, because what they have tried to do with the election now,
You're saying your opponents don't like that?
Well, the establishment, the Democratic establishment does not like that. Not just my opponents, because I have been very actively involved with trying to prove and to highlight for the American people that this fraudulent attempt to basically delegitimize the last election and to prevent a man who was elected President of the United States from assuming the lawful authority that the voters gave him. I have never seen this in my lifetime in this country's history. I don't know if it's happened before. I've never seen it. And we should be starting the clock when we're looking at why this is happening and go back to where Hillary was making money for for her Clinton Foundation and the things that were happening there, rather than starting it up a little bit further with the investigation.
Trump and the investigation.
Right.
So really, the Russians got involved in the election through Hillary.
Yeah.
Comey thought Hillary was going to win, so he actually opened the investigation up. Now we're finding out in his book, right before the election, because, in his words, he didn't want to delegitimize her presidency by having had not properly investigated or vetted her.
Right.
And now we're finding out it was all a sham.
It was a sham.
And now they're trying to delegitimize Trump. Shocker of all shocks, he won.
Yes. Well, this is a very sad time in our country's history, because the respect for our institutions, especially the right of the people to vote and select the president, that is never have we had somebody then try to undermine the authority of the new president and trying to prevent him. This president has about 1/3 of his appointees that have been able to be accepted, and they've been putting every roadblock they could in the way of this man. And those things that he has been able to get done. By the way, he's done some great things as just with executive orders, but he has had to overcome obstacles that no other president's had to overcome.
Okay, so now some of your opposition are claiming that you've got a relationship with Russia, that you and Putin are buddies or something like that. Do me a favor and explain what relationship you've got with Russia and how that came about.
Okay, well, first of all, I have been an anti-communist and an anti-Soviet all my life. And you will know, I mean, look, I was a speechwriter for President Reagan, and I wrote many of his hardcore anti-Soviet speeches, and I'm very pleased, too, because Ronald Reagan knew how to do it. He was really tough on the Soviets, but he was always open to try to talk to them and to try to reach a deal. And that's what he did, and that's how we ended the Cold War. When I even went to Afghanistan and was with the Mujahideen fighting Soviet troops. We were actually killing Soviet troops during that part of the Cold War. But Reagan was, offering a better way, and they were willing to go that way. The Trump has the same thing: a tough fist, but an open hand. Now, where do we go back to your question about me knowing this is Russians? I was an anti-Soviet, anti-communist from all the way through, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, I was never against Russian people. Mm-hmm. Never was I. I was against communist ideology, a Russia that was driven, called the Soviet Union, by the ideology that was going to place atheist dictatorships in power all over the world and replace democracies. So when Russia gave up that whole communist ideology, which it did, and the communist system collapsed, I felt now's the time for us to work with Russia in every way we can so that Russia can become included in the family of nations. And like any other major power, and Russia is a major power, even though it's not a communist state anymore, it's a major power, and it's not as democratic as would meet our standards, there's no doubt about that. But there are challenges that we face and the Russians face that I believe we should work together on. And by constantly vilifying Russia for everything, that even things that we do, if they do it, then we condemn them for it. By being that hostile all the time, we are preventing ourselves from working together with Russia to defeat radical Islam and to contain China. And those, right now, Chinese expansionism and radical Islamic terrorism are the two things we need to defeat for the safety of our own people. So I've been a strong advocate of working with Russia to defeat those entities.
And had we had a stronger relationship with Russia, we might not have Putin in there helping Syria? Is that kind of the logic that you're
In
presenting?
fact, I believe that if we would have had a more cooperative relationship, we could have reached a compromise situation that would have been acceptable to all those people. Assad, probably could have kept a certain area. You might have been reorganized the structure so you have states there where some of them are Kurds and some of them are Christians. And we could have worked a compromise out. But instead, we've been so belligerent, it's impossible for us to try to work a compromise. By the way, the Russians helped us with a compromise with Gaddafi in Libya. And then we broke our word to him. And of course, we used our military to help oust Gaddafi. And what happened then? What happened was a massive disruption of the Middle East. And instead of having one bad guy, Gaddafi, who was a dictator, we end up with ISIL controlling about a third of that country and using it as a staging area on attacks on others. So, there's every reason to cooperate. And because I'm aggressive on that, that's being portrayed as I'm some sort of Russian file or whatever. I'm sorry, that's just not the case. I'm an American patriot, and that's good for our country. And in terms of Putin, I met him once, years ago. It's a very famous meeting now because he came over right after the fall of communism with a group of young leaders, and they visited various offices in the capital. They came to see me. And I said to him, look, I'm going to play a game of football with some American friends of mine. Is anyone out there would like to play American-style football this weekend? Putin and two other guys stood up. I didn't know. He's deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And so we played football. By the way, they had no idea who they were playing football with. I mean, Scooter Libby was one of the guys. In fact, the people who were playing football were the ultimate Cold Warriors. I mean, one of the guys. So after we got done playing football, we went up to a pub and we started, and I mentioned how we had won the Cold War. And they go, oh, no, you didn't win the Cold War. We just gave up communism. I said, no, we won the Cold War. No, we gave up. So we decided to settle it the way men settle things at the bar.
And, arm wrestling?
And I got an arm wrestling match with Putin. And he put me down just like that. Bam! He's a very strong man. And then my friend who was with me in Afghanistan, and I know personally was responsible for firing at least 20 or 30 120 millimeter rockets into a Soviet position in Afghanistan. He was with me. As I say, they had no idea who they're playing football with. And he says, Dana, why don't you let me try it? And I said, okay. And he sits down, and Putin's going like this. And he said, Dana, when do I start? I said, do it now. And he goes, bam! And Putin goes down, and Putin jumps up. And he goes, CIA, CIA. And my friend punches him in the chest and goes, KGB, KGB. So, but anyway, that's the only time I've ever met Putin. The only time.
So you're not buds and you don't go way back?
No, it's all BS. It is talking about exaggeration. I have met him once, and of course only if that type of personal attack, saying that I'm Putin's best friend or Putin's best pal in Congress, that only can happen with a conservative. If we would have done that during the Cold War and said, oh, that congressman over there, he's the communist's best friend or Mao Zedong's best friend, then we would have been castigated as being McCarthyites and name callers and such. But there's no truth at all to the fact that I'm pro-Russia, I'm pro-USA, and we need to work together with Russia in those areas. Now,
assuming that they work with us, obviously, you're not going to go and give away the ship like
that's what a compromise is. That's you work together with somebody, and they know. As I say, I think we could have had peace in Syria. I think that we could have eliminated a great number of these radical Islamic terrorists, who, by the way, kill Russians as well. But but just so everybody knows, there's an important factor here. And they say, well, why did you meet so many Russians that have been involved with this Mueller's investigation? Well, there aren't so many of them, there's a few. But what's important is I am the chairman of the committee in the United States Congress. My subcommittee in the Foreign Affairs Committee has jurisdiction over overseeing our relations with Russia. I'm the chairman of the committee.
So it's part of your job,
of course,
to meet with the Russians.
Of course. I'm supposed to meet with, I don't care what they're advocating, I'm supposed to meet with them and hear what's going on with the Russians. And I will say that I have met with more. For example, my area covers Central Asia, Russia, and Europe. And I have talked to many, many more anti-Russian Ukrainians than I have with Russians. But the fact that I've spoken to some Russians, that's being presented in a very sinister way. And, these people on the internet calling me a traitor and all of these things, I don't like that. But they can continue doing it because I know that they're just stupid.
Yes, uneducated. All right, switching subjects again. We had school shootings, tragic as they are. And, of course, the mainstream media, it's like genuflex. They just cannot help themselves. Gun control. If they only controlled guns, we wouldn't have the school shooting. Of course, we've now heard in England where they're using knives because the guns are under control. So you tell me, what do you think the problem is, the solution is, maybe the federal government's role in being part of that solution?
Well, we know that there's a problem that too many Americans, whether they're just students on a campus or ordinary Americans, are being murdered or wounded by someone with a gun, with a criminal with a gun, or someone in their school going crazy. So, okay, I understand that's a problem, and it's a challenge of how to fix that without actually making us more vulnerable by taking away guns from innocent people. So here's the Rohrabacher solution. This is what I've been advocating, and that is the United States government creates a database that's available to the public, and the database will have two lines of two groups of people, and the database will be everyone committed of a felony in our country, and anyone here who's here as well who has committed felonies elsewhere. But if you're a felon, you're on that list, and many of these young people who have been murdering, going crazy and murdering their fellow students, many of them have been on some sort of psycho drug, something to deal with their psychology, something to control their behavior. Maybe they're being, whatever it is, they are on some kind of drug pattern to control their behavior. And in so many cases, the shooters have been on these drugs. And what we need to do is have a list, have the psychologists and the psychiatrists and the doctors determine which drugs those are that make someone vulnerable to depression, etc., and say, okay, if you're on that drug, you're on this list too. And the list is available, and then you say it is illegal to sell guns or ammunition to any felon or anybody who's on these psycho drugs. And that, to me, would go a long way. We do not need, every time someone wants to buy a gun, that we have to have a background check on him or her. But when you say if someone wants to buy a gun, you just see if they're on that list. If they're not on the list, then you don't have to worry about it.
The trick, obviously, is keeping that list current and accurate.
Correct. But we can do that.
But it would be an indicator, right?
Yeah.
They either have psychological problems,
right,
or they're bad guys.
That's it.
Okay. Taxes and spending. You know, Reagan's old joke, which was just wonderful, is and he stole it from Maggie Thatcher, but communism doesn't work because eventually you run out of other people's money. Tell me, over your 30 years in Congress, what you've done to help us keep more of our own money.
Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing is that I have those people who are really specialists in this have given me awards all the way up until now as being a very frugal member of Congress, and being they're kind of frugality awards and also opposing tax increase awards. So I've got the National Taxpayers Union and Citizens for a Sound Economy, and I've got really high marks from all of these groups that give out awards. So that's number one, how you can tell that I've been voting the right way. But I think it's important that I've been trying to find, the most important thing for us is to try to find alternative ways of accomplishing what is a government mission. Like I say, when I wrote the Commercial Space Act, I wrote it in order to make sure we had more money coming into the space program, but not from tax dollars. So you got to find ways of getting things done that do not require some sort of new source of revenue to be extracted from the people, but instead finding a new revenue source that doesn't have to come from the pockets of the taxpayer. And there's lots of things that I've been very involved in trying to create alternatives. But for example, the president wants to build a wall down there, and I support that. I think it's good. If nothing else, it'd be very symbolic. Our southern border has a wall, and symbolic all the way through. Okay. But it's a really expensive project. We're talking about probably $50 billion. So I've talked to the president about this, and it's still a possibility that will be the plan. We have not finalized this yet, and he hasn't totally accepted it yet, but I'm advocating this. This is what I advocate. This is how I do it. And here's the plan, the Rohrabacher plan again, is we have now 1 million legal immigrants coming into our country every year. I support that, by the way. I've never been opposed to that number of legal. It's 1/3%. I mean, give me a break. We can absorb that, but we want to make sure the people who are coming are the right kind of people and not criminals or whatever. Well, of the 1 million people we come in every year, 55,000 of them are from a lottery. The Democrats insisted that we have a lottery, meaning you're just picking them at random. One of the guys
not merit, not other things that
right,
you would normally consider.
Right, just a lottery.
Why?
This guy, Schumer's been insisting on it. It makes us more open and democratic. No, we're acting like a bunch of fools, bringing in people that were not selected. A guy from Uzbekistan won the lottery about 4 or 5 years ago. Well, he went crazy because he shouldn't have ever been allowed here because he wasn't fit to be here. He was so frustrated, he drove a truck into a bunch of tourists in New York and killed a few. And he came here from the lottery. Well, that again shows how wacko left-wing the Democrats have gotten when they do things like this. But my policy would say you eliminate that 55,000 from the lottery, but you still have those slots. And my plan is you put the word out. If you're not a terrorist or a criminal, and you're overseas and you want to become an American, we establish a fund that can only be used for upgrading American border security. And then you say, those people, you put $1 million into that, you'll get a green card. We're going to check you out, so you're not a criminal or anything. But you immediately get a green card, and 2 years later, unless there's some problem, you're going to get citizenship. You got 55 slots, and $1 million a head will pay for the wall.
Well, that's an interesting thought. So basically, you're selling citizenship,
Right.
assuming that they qualify.
Right.
For those that are really, really anxious to get in.
And they're successful people.
And they're successful people, the kind of people that you would want to have come in because they're going to be job producers, et cetera.
Correct.
And that will help the other side, funding the wall. Okay, so I have to ask you on the funding the wall. We just had this Omnibus Bill that they called it,
Yeah.
which I believe you voted against.
Yes.
And Trump sits there and he talks about all these things that he's going to hold the swamp down. The swamp passes the Omnibus Bill, and Trump signs it.
Yeah.
Now, I know personally I could sit there and say, well, you know, if he signed it, it had all this bad stuff in there, if at least he had something to show for it. For instance, funding the wall. If he would have had funding the wall in it, but he had to take all these other bad things with it in order to get the funding for the wall, I think most people would have sat there and said, you know, we'll suck it up and do it, we'll kill those things later, just get the stinking wall built. But he didn't even get that. Explain that if you can.
Yeah, the system's broke. Trump's not broke. The system's broke. Clearly, we've been having the same problem for years now, and it's been getting worse and worse and worse. When Reagan was president himself, I'll never forget it, there was an omnibus bill. It was that thick. When you have bills that thick, that means you're not voting on each one individually. And this is not the way you run a country or run a budget process. And I remember we actually worked with the president on his statement that he was going to give before Congress, and he had a copy of this bill, I don't know if you remember, and he threw it down in the middle of the speech. And then he said, you can't have bills this big and expect my veto to mean anything or expect the American people to be able to differentiate. That's wrong. And I'm going to start vetoing these bills if you don't make it better. Well, anyway, the next day, I was in the Oval Office with the president. And Reagan's had his finger was all wrapped in bandages. And I said, Mr. President, what happened to your hand? And he said, well, Dana, that darn speech was so heavy and so big, when I threw it down, it smashed my finger.
That's a big bill.
That's right. Yeah. When bills get that big, there's a problem.
Okay, so why didn't Trump veto it?
Well, you know, because if he vetoed it, it would have meant the government closed down. It means that all of these...
And that means what? We're safe from the government
no,
trying to help us?
It means, no, it gives you some breathing room. But what we've done this in the past. We keep doing it. That's why I say the system's broke. You know, once or twice happened with Reagan. Now it's happening almost every year. So what we need to do is make sure that we use the time in between to fix the system. But it's broke, and I don't see...
now we're expecting the swamp to... I mean, I remember during the Reagan years, even it was, it reminds me of the hamburger guy, right? You know, pay me now, I'll get for a hamburger today, I'll pay you back Tuesday.
Right.
I mean, it's like, hey, I'll go ahead and sign the tax increase now, you give me my tax savings later. Of course, you never get the tax savings. I mean, why is it the Republicans are so afraid of shutting down the government?
Well, we should be afraid to shut down the government because you have many scientific projects that are going on that would have to stop in the middle of the thing, which could really make it last longer and cost a lot more, or things that need to be developed and protected and are not. There's a cost to shutting down the government. It's not, if there wasn't, it'd be a good idea just to shut it down. But
can't you selectively shut it down?
Well, it's you really, not with an omnibus bill you can't, because whatever's covered in that bill isn't going to be covered then. Some elements of the government still are operating, but you end up with contracts, for example, for different companies to complete you're going to stop their payment then, It'll end up costing you more.
Right, and they're
to
going to
get
lay
them
off
started again.
workers for a month while you're figuring it all out.
Exactly. So it's not as an easy a thing. I don't think we should be shutting down the government, but sometimes obviously the stand has to be made where you think you can actually then get someone to agree to something fundamental that will put us back into a legitimate process. But right now it's broken, and Paul Ryan, I think, leaving, actually, I like Paul a lot, but he has had no success whatsoever in creating a workable process for our budget.
Okay, talk to me about Obamacare. One of the things Republicans ran on was we're going to kill it. Oh, we need a House. You get the House. Oh, we'll kill it. Then you need the Senate. Then you get the Senate. Now you got the White House. Now the latest thing seems to be, oh, we need 60 votes in the Senate. At what point are we going to trust the Republicans to continue or to keep their word if they just keep asking for more?
Well, that's you're putting your finger on one thing. When Obamacare is an example of that, but we have a real problem in this 60-vote rule in the Senate. It is not in the Constitution that for a bill to pass the United States Senate, it requires 60 votes.
Right. They're allowed in the Constitution to set their own rules, and they've made that one of their rules.
Yeah, that is not in the requirement, constitutional requirement. So what I told Paul, and here he's leaving, Paul Ryan's leaving now. He didn't have the guts to do this. This is one of the things needed to correct the process we're talking about. We've got to make sure that the Senate is not operating on a 60-vote rule. And we could have gone eyeball to eyeball with the Senate and fought it out. It would have taken a lot of time. It would have taken maybe 100 days or 120 days of really strain and stress, but we could have done it. That's what the process is supposed to be, and we didn't.
You mean over Obamacare, for instance?
Over any number of things. Obamacare would have certainly.
So you would have just basically stopped business until the Senate decided that a majority is really all you need to pass a bill.
Right, because we were already, yes, the answer is that. And I think they would have given in, and we would have had a process then that we could have actually started heading towards more responsible spending and also be putting in reforms that worked, like stuff on Obamacare. Right now, to get something through, then you got if you're going to go through both houses, you got a 60-vote requirement in the Senate. Now, I happen to have a basic fundamental reform plan for this whole Medicare thing and for this whole Obamacare fiasco. And this is what I'm pushing. Again, I'm a maverick in Washington. I admit that a lot of people do not like that, and then some people think that I'm too lockstep with the Republicans. But I have a lot of creative ideas that I'm approaching this thing, not just the standard way you're going through the hoops like this, but instead making sure the people on the top, at the White House in particular, know that this is an alternative. And here's the idea.
The unveiling. Go for it.
The unveiling, here it is. And I've spoken to both Republican leaders in the House and the Senate, and I haven't had a chance to speak to the president about it yet. But here it is. Okay, why is there a crisis? Why did we have Obamacare in the first place? Because people with pre-existing conditions were being priced out of the insurance market, so they had no health insurance at all.
Right.
So technology keeps everybody alive, and now they've got a pre-existing condition. My daughter, for example, had leukemia about 5 years ago. She had leukemia. It was really, of course, scared the heck out of all of us, and
very devastating.
And it was a tough fight, but she now is leukemia-free. But remember, she's leukemia-free. 30 years ago, 90% of all the kids with leukemia died. Now, 90% of the kids live, but they have pre-existing conditions now because leukemia can come back and often does, and they have to go to a treatment again. So my daughter and everybody else with a precondition, diabetes or whatever it is, they are going to end up, when my daughter's got her own health insurance plan, it's going to be so much more expensive because she's got a pre-existing condition. So here's what we do. Again, have the government make a registrar of all people when you determine what are the pre-existing conditions in our country that are really significant in the cost of health care. So what you do is you have that cataloged, every single American with a pre-existing condition, and then you just say the federal government, whenever that pre-existing condition has to be treated, pays for that pre-existing condition. It could be Medicare, Medi-Cal. It's going to be the taxpayers one way or the other, because the American people are going to pay for it anyway. How Obamacare did it is they mixed all the people together, except for government employees who were exempt from that, I might add.
They're special.
Yes, they're special, right. So you put, Obamacare put them all in with it, and then everybody's insurance rates went up. So my plan is you take everybody with a pre-existing condition, you have that special, they get taken care of, and then Medicare or Medi-Cal, whatever, here in California, Medicaid, every time they treat someone with a pre-existing condition, they get reimbursed through the general fund. But here's the hook. Here's what makes me different than all the other Democrat plans, and that is you have to insist that the people who are on that list of where they get their pre-existing condition taken care of, that those people have to have insurance for everything else. So what you've got is a broken leg, you're in an automobile wreck, you got some kind of a flu bug or whatever it is, you have to have insurance that will cover that. But because you've taken out and bifurcated all of the pre-existing conditions, the insurance rates go way down. So even young people will be able to afford it. And you say, if you want a pre-existing condition taken care of, I'm sorry, here's your choice. You can get into the system or not, but don't expect us to pay for anything if you don't have your own insurance. So that's, by the way, everybody I've talked to thought that was a good idea. American people are going to have to pay for it one way or the other. It's better to do it through Medicare and then being reimbursed rather than having us go through this system, this horrible, complex idea of putting it in with the rest of us and making sure the insurance companies are balancing everything up.